So I hope everyone had a nice lunch. We are continuing with our work on the federal tax and budget bill. And we are lucky enough to have Wesley Thorpe from Center on Budget and Policy Priorities here with us in person. Thank you again for making this journey. And in case I forget to say it, we are back here after the floor. And we have witnesses who are coming here for after the floor. So please come here after the floor. Thank you. Okay, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Great. It's really my pleasure to be here. Chair Kornheiser, members. Hope it's a great afternoon. I know we're in that after lunch hour, so it's also often sometimes a little bit of the groggy hour. I'll do my best to work through that personally, and hopefully we can have a lively conversation here for the next hour and a half. So I'm Wesley Thorpe. I'm a senior advisor for state tax policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in DC. Again, just really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity and the conversation to follow. I'll say I'm really glad that Carl and I were both here. We both have a chance to sort of share some insights and expertise. I think you'll also get a little bit of a window into both sort of the way our respective expertise layer and complement a bit, as well as just a bit of different almost styles of presentation, if you will. I'm afraid I don't have a PowerPoint presentation today. I sort of think best as a writer. So I do have some written remarks that in places I'll probably read through fairly closely to make sure some of the more technical elements and the nuance are really being accurately portrayed. In other cases, I'll probably speak to them a little more thematically. Also, as with Carl, if there are places where I'm being a little unclear, moving too quickly, feel free to raise your hand and jump in and we can kind of pause and go from there. So just again, a little bit of a quick introduction. Center on Budget is an independent nonpartisan research institute in DC. Since 1981, we've been working on both federal and state policies. We really strive, as we describe it, to work to build a nation where everyone has the resources they need to thrive. I've been with the center doing various aspects of sort of state-focused fiscal policy work for a little over the last 7 years, and in this general line of work for about 15 years overall. Not to give my life story, but the first chunk of that time was spent down at the State House in Georgia, where I was born and raised. Really cutting my teeth in this kind of work, sitting in a lot of committees like this. I think I was the only person in Georgia for about 7 years who probably went to every single subcommittee hearing of Ways and Means. I was sometimes the only person in that room. So it's really a thrill to be back. And I'll admit, unlike Carl, a new State House, this is only my second time in Vermont. And that's even if you only count a sort of one night stay over in Norwich this summer on a roundabout way back from Acadia, headed back to Boston. So it's a real pleasure to be here with y'all for some conversation. One of the things that I'm going to do today and really focus the bulk of my time is, again, not to contrast too much with this morning's presentation, to almost take a little bit of a step back and offer a bit more of a wide angle lens on the events of the past year, in particular the passage of HR 1 and its broader fiscal implications for the state, inclusive in some cases, and I won't belabor them, those conformity elements that we spent so much time on this morning, but also thinking about additional fiscal pressures that are going to be coming short, medium, and long term from the changes that were made federally on the spending side of the ledger that, again, are going to have, as many of you, of course, all of you likely already know very well, are going to have significant implications for the state both today and down the road. So I'm going to spend really my presentation talking primarily about two things. First is sort of concisely summarizing into three major buckets those fiscal challenges from HR 1 coming to Vermont and other states over the coming years. And then in the end, I'll sort of briefly present sort of some modest recommendations, if you will, a bit of a framework as we see things for how, despite the significant challenges coming to Vermont and other states from HR 1, it also really does provide state and local policymakers here nationwide with a really enormous opportunity. One that was not necessarily asked for, but regardless, is really a chance to pursue a very thoughtful and in some cases potentially bold response that really centers the needs of the state's people and communities. And specifically because of the room we're in, the way tax policy and revenue policy are really going to play a very critical role in that response to the federal changes. So to start, I know y'all have, as was alluded to this morning, already heard, probably some presentations about the overall components of HR1, what's in the bill. And so I won't spend too much time on this, but just really to summarize the reconciliation package at a high level. It basically includes aggregate tax cuts of about $4.5 trillion over a decade. Whatever one might think of them, just mathematically, as Carl was describing, tilted pretty significantly towards the nation's wealthier households and corporations. Just in Vermont, the law is expected to save households with incomes in the top 1%, nearly $60,000 on average a year. That's about 500 times more than the expected annual savings for households with incomes in the bottom 20%, which is about $110 a year. Overall, 70% of those tax benefits, $730 million in 2026, are going to be directed to Vermonters with incomes in the top 20%. So the other side of the ledger is, how are those tax reductions financed? And the federal package does a couple of things. One is it partially finances those cuts with a fairly sweeping set of cuts to programs designed to either fight climate change in some cases, or more substantially, to help programs that help low and moderate income people afford essentially healthcare and groceries, so Medicaid and SNAP. Some of those changes shift significant new responsibilities to state and local governments. Again, as y'all, I think, have probably already been hearing a lot about. Meanwhile, the rest of the tax cuts are financed sort of with the credit card, right? Adding about $3.4 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. That's going to be about $4 trillion to the debt once you factor in sort of accounting for the interest payments. So together, those federal policy choices are expected to create considerable new challenges, as I said, for state and local budgets, which brings us here today, the tax and finance implications. Those challenges, as I'll walk through, can be kind of concisely characterized into three buckets. So the first is, as we were discussing at length this morning, the immediate fiscal implications from the tax cuts themselves due to various conformity linkages between the tax codes. Second is a suite of, importantly, short to medium term direct fiscal implications of recent federal actions, namely those historic spending cuts and new state responsibilities for Medicaid and SNAP. And then third, something I'll talk about that I think is going to be interesting and important, and probably some conversation around, is the specter of additional longer term indirect costs that could accumulate on both the state and local level over time. As you see sort of various sorts of harm, in particular, people losing access to healthcare and other vital services, sort of start to show up downstream as it sort of cycles through the system, if you will. So I will also note, I'm feeling a little self-conscious about drinking out of a red Solo cup here, so I promise this.
We know it is not full of beer.
Yeah, it is just water from the water.
Thanks for letting us know. I think we were the ones who provided the red Solo cup, so.
That is correct. So.
Yeah. We do it just to make the committee even sillier than already.
Partying with his mains all the time.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've been to lots of ways and means parties. This is one of the better ones, right?
Thanks.
All right.
Are you gonna get into what you were saying about indirect costs? Because I'm just very, the impact of sort of the recent federal actions, I think, are much clearer in some other states than they are here. And so it's the indirect cost is where I'm sort of the most nervous in the context of Vermont. And so I'm really glad you're going to get into that. Thank you.
Yes, I definitely will spend some time on that. And also we can sort of pause for conversation as needed, given the nuance and complexities there.
Thank
So as I alluded to, there's sort of the three buckets I want to walk through: conformity, short to medium term stuff, and the indirect long term things. I won't sort of belabor conformity at length, if you will. There'll be a little bit of just summarizing and to a large extent seconding a fair amount of the insights and perspective that Carl shared. In the case of the most recent federal tax changes, there are, several provisions with noteworthy implications for Vermont and other states, especially on the corporate income tax side, as we were talking about. In most cases, those were expansions to existing business tax, making them permanent. There are also sort of the suite of new personal income tax carve-outs for tips and overtime. And something I would note here that I don't think came up this morning is one thing that we've seen with sort of this suite of new federal provisions and their complexities and all the ways they interlock is just a growing number of states really digging in and publishing sort of estimates to try to get a handle on these things and what they're going to cost. Vermont is thankfully now one of those, by my last count, 20 states. Because it's not one of these things where when the law passed federally, it was particularly clear there was some sort of master spreadsheet or something of what this is going to cost states. So a little bit of note of gratitude there to echo this morning that some great work has been done on that front already. Speaking of that, so I was looking at some of the initial analyses in Vermont's case of the conformity linkages. And I think it's fair to say for a couple of reasons that it does appear that at least overall, some of those initial conformity linkages may appear relatively modest at first glance. In large part, for some of what was shared this morning around the WISE move back in 2017 or 2018, I believe, to move that state's starting calculation points from FDI to from federal taxable income to federal adjusted gross income. So that has provided sort of an initial layer of protection for Vermont against some of those sharper impacts that other states are seeing. So I just wanted to kind of echo that. It is also worth noting, though, that there is inherent uncertainty here, just given the scope and complexity of the provisions. Something that analyses in other states have been speaking to, not to say that Vermont hasn't by any means, but sort of a general question mark around how the interactions with states and the business side, the sort of expansive business tax provisions in the federal reconciliation package, those impacts could very well conceivably rise substantially over the long term. So that's something just as a possibility to kind of keep in mind. I'll also just kind of conclude here by, putting a fine point on, again, something we discussed at length that is often lost, I don't think in this room, but sometimes in state tax policy conversations generally, that states are really under no obligation to adopt, generally speaking, really any of the federal tax changes under their tax codes that they don't see wise. So this is a case where, state policymakers obviously have a ton of leeway to really do what is most sound and thoughtful and sensible. So the second kind of general.
And that's what you're looking at when it's over. You can remember the things you said.
I went back and forth on whether to send it ahead of time. I've had mixed
I get
experiences with it, but this will be submitted.
Awesome. Thanks.
And in some cases, not to get in the weeds here, but the sort of formal final version will also have a lot of additional resources for further reading on things that in some cases I sort of know enough to be dangerous on, if you will. Kind of health policy experts, SNAP experts, that kind of thing. And I really focus on the linkages with the fiscal side. Anyways, this will be available.
Thank you. Representative Woody?
Follow up that, is this gonna be in prose or a slideshow or what?
I don't have a presentation unlike my colleague and friend, Carl.
Prose is good.
Yeah, this is prose.
Thank you.
Either one's fine, I just.
Yeah, we have a ton of resources with a lot of charts and a lot of data, but I'm not looking at that on my screen right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this is interesting. I know that this is not a sort of Medicaid and SNAP committee, if you will, here today, but there is really, so much meat and so much really interesting interaction with the tax and revenue side, conversations that are happening in state houses nationwide, and what happened recently federally when it comes to food assistance and health policy. And so I want to kind of unpack, again, fairly briskly in a high level and answer questions that may come up on these interactions. So thinking about the reconciliation package. So as folks know, the implementation for several of the provisions kind of on the Medicaid and SNAP side of things are staggered over the coming years. Some are already in effect, some are not for a couple of years. And so I want to spend a little bit of time walking through these fiscal implications and challenges from the standpoint of their respective timing, the kind of when they're going to be coming down to Vermont and to states. So first is that, Vermont and others are going to be compelled right away, basically, to invest the funds necessary to stand up various sorts of new administrative requirements in Medicaid and SNAP particularly. So in some cases, these are going to be one-time expenditures. So things like agencies needing to make new investments in IT systems. In other cases, importantly, they're going to be ongoing commitments. So for example, in Arizona, the healthcare agency is requesting about 300 new FTEs to implement the law's new expansive Medicaid work requirements. Now, because these administrative requirements are either already in effect, such as with the SNAP expanded work requirements, or are required to be online no later than January 2027, that's in the case of Medicaid work requirements. Even with some limited federal support for some of that, Vermont and other states are going to have to accommodate those new spending needs basically during the current 2026 legislative session for FY27 budgets. Another new cost that states are going to have to account for this year as they're crafting their budgets is an increase to the share of SNAP administrative expenses that states are required to cover. So just quickly, without going too deep here, historically, states have had to cover 50% of the cost of administering SNAP, with the federal government paying the other half. HR 1 increases the state share of 75%, which in the case of Vermont, if I'm correct in my reading, is expected to cost an extra $8.4 million annually. I think that's according to the State's Department of Children and Families. So that's for FY27. And then beginning in fiscal year 28 is when states are going to face two of the more significant fiscal implications from HR 1. So the first of those is what is a new, so unprecedented funding requirement for states to share in the cost of SNAP food benefits. And then the second are new limits on what are, as you know, called provider taxes that basically every state other than Alaska uses to help fund their Medicaid program. So starting with SNAP, most states are going to be required to pay 5 to 15% of food benefits starting in October of 27. So this is based on kind of what are called error rates, which is sort of a measure of under and over payments that states make in their SNAP programs. Depending on that error rate, the state's increased cost for their share could range from 7 million to 22 million annually. I will note, and this is important and interesting, I think, at the moment, Vermont is one of a small handful of states with an error rate low enough. I believe it's 5.13%, so as to not trigger this cost sharing requirement. But if that rate were to rise even slightly to 6% or higher as the threshold is where it would kick in. This is a little bit of nuance, and I promise not to go way in the weeds here, but it's worth highlighting. Talking to a couple of my colleagues across the organization who work really closely on these issues the past few days, is their take is that what is essentially delayed and incomplete guidance so far from USDA, along with some of the fallout from the government shutdown, are making these sort of errors on the state level more likely. Such that states like Vermont that have been previously able to stay, kind of below 6% could very well have a hard time maintaining that level, just based on, again, sort of some of the, again, incomplete and in a case or two, arguably chaotic guidance thus far.
I'm just going to jump in for a second. If folks want to go deeper on this, the Joint Fiscal Committee took a lot of testimony on this fall. And what you were saying about sort of concerns about the error rate in the context of the shutdown was probably one of our biggest concerns about how to navigate the shutdown, was to just do everything we could to avoid that error rate, but knowing that was a big risk. Representative Odie, did you have a question?
Thank you. I think this was covered in the fall, but when we decided to pay SNAP benefits in that intervening region, did that $6 million, is that going to be considered an error?
No, the reason we structured it the way we structured it was so that it would fall outside of essentially the program as it's designed, so that it wouldn't.
Thank you. I've been worrying about.
But that's a big, yeah, and there is more testimony about that. And I can find the Joint Fiscal Committee testimony to send around.
I can stop worrying.
I mean, there's a lot to worry about, so you. Yeah, back to you.
Great. So yeah, a lot to dig into further there on SNAP. And so I'll actually pivot here to talk a little bit about the second of the two big challenges coming online towards FY28, which is the provider tax issue. So I'm not a deep dive in the wool health policy expert, but at a high level here, what we know to be clear, federal bill imposes a set of fairly strict new limits on this revenue raising tool that states, again, all but Alaska have used for a while now to help fund Medicaid that are expected to kind of erode its effectiveness over time. Here in Vermont, from what I was looking at, JFO recently estimated that these new limits could reduce revenue from the state's hospital fee by about $15 million starting in FY28, rising to an estimated $133 million annually by FY33. I'll also quickly note, again, from a conversation I had with a colleague this week, sort of potentially compounding these losses on the provider tax side is something around how something I've been told is that Vermont has done a lot of great work through a current 1115 Medicaid waiver to sort of expand coverage in certain innovative types of ways. HR1 makes some fairly significant changes to those 1115 waivers that appear likely to potentially impact renewal of that for Vermont and some other states, which I think could force the state to make some hard trade-offs around potentially needing to find revenue of their own to continue some of the coverage that has been provided through that demonstration. Again, that's something that I could point to additional resources and experts on if there was interest down the road of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. In the healthcare realm, are they doing anything with federal directives?
They are. This is something where those were sort of reined in and limited in certain ways as well that have some fiscal implications that I would have to go back and sort of review some resources that we have on to sort of fully re-wrap my own head around. But that is something, the directed payments that there were changes on, that there are some implications on. We could get you more information.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll make a note of that. So I do want to spend some time because I know we're going to have a lot of great conversation on this sort of like indirect cost over the long term piece. So we can get into that now. The bottom line here, something that we've been thinking about a lot, and others is that as a result of HR1, again, whatever one may think about of it at a high level, is going to carry some significant disruptions to people's health coverage, food assistance, and potentially likely other public services, that could carry some long-term state and local fiscal implications over time that could prove substantial and are difficult to fully foresee, but are, things that I can provide a little bit of color on. Most prominently in our take is you're going to have, potentially this surge of people nationwide, about 15 million people nationwide estimated, including as many as 16,000 Vermonters, losing access to Medicaid or Affordable Care Act marketplace coverage. That is likely going to translate, I think experts largely view over time into more significant people showing up at local emergency rooms and clinics without the ability to pay. So those uncompensated care costs can be pretty sizable, put substantial strain on hospitals and other providers, especially folks who serve sort of disproportionate levels of low-income people, other vulnerable populations. So these uncompensated care costs could rise by about $280 billion nationwide over the next decade due to people losing coverage. That includes by about $200 million potentially over that span in Vermont.
Or what time period?
Over the next decade. I also want to highlight here, at the same time, even though there is significant fear, rightly so, of significant expansions in uninsured people and potentially folks losing their food benefits as well, it is important to note there are actions that Vermont policymakers and states generally can take to potentially limit those forms of long-term fallout. So states have options for reducing administrative hassle and mistakes that can lead eligible people to lose their coverage. By working to ensure as many people as possible still receive benefits for which they're eligible, policymakers would in turn likely limit those increases in uncompensated care and other indirect spillover costs to communities over time. So that would involve things, again, for general awareness, I know outside the immediate focus of this committee, but be that as it may, things like investing in human services, agencies, staffing, and technology, basically trying to make it as simple and free of red tape as possible when determining who is eligible for these programs under the expanded new federal requirements to keep people sort of in those programs and to limit, again, those longer term indirect costs that could kind of be spilling over to state and local finances over time. So I'm going to pivot now, if there are no immediate questions, to a little bit of the sort of second portion of what I want to talk about some to really, I think, cue up kind of the conversation we can have with the rest of our time around what it, in our view, is kind of a framework for thinking about how to respond to this suite of challenges that I've unpacked due to the passage of the federal amendment bill. Specifically, that framework is going to be around how Vermont and states, in our view, really have, as I mentioned earlier, kind of this enormous opportunity to pursue a really thoughtful yet bold response centering the needs of the state's people and communities around a focus on revenue and its importance. So stating the obvious to folks here, and I know I know Vermont is actually the one state with a little bit of nuance here around how states and localities have to balance their budgets every year, unlike Congress. But absent, what that means as a practical matter is absent a policy response that really centers and prioritizes revenue. Sort of these fiscal implications from the federal package from HR 1 could mean potentially significant harm, not only to sort of states' new responsibilities for healthcare and food assistance, but also like the full constellation of public services, because as costs go up there, if there's not a focus on revenue, that might mean having to shift funds from equally important other parts of the budget. So what I essentially want to say is that in order to sort of prevent that indirect harm, in order to really center the importance of people and communities in the response forward, protecting the state's existing revenue system and ideally further strengthening it by raising new revenues will be essential for an adequate state response in this moment. And, I want to kind of close my portion of talking here by suggesting that Vermont, again, modestly suggesting, devote attention to kind of three general areas. So the first is I have some written remarks here, but I'm largely just going to say that the first recommendation is sort of echoing kind of a conversation with Carl and what he had to say about the importance of preserving revenues the state would otherwise lose due to federal tax cuts. This is especially important in the case of the expansive new tax benefits for kind of the corporate side of the ledger. Policymakers in Colorado, Delaware, Maine, Pennsylvania, and others have already chosen to start decoupling from at least large portions of. And then second on conformity is, again, just echoing, ideally, policymakers avoiding the possible temptation to proactively conform to those various new personal income tax deductions for things like tips and overtime. They're expected to provide really only a modest benefit to a small subset of workers. They kind of open opportunities for unscrupulous employers to game the system a bit and claim those benefits for themselves. And it's not an insignificant amount of revenue. So in Vermont, linking to the new federal deductions for tips and overtime could cost an estimated $23 million a year in lost revenue, while only benefiting about 1 out of every 20 workers. There's also a risk that those revenue impacts could prove larger over time than expected. So in Alabama, for example, lawmakers in 2023 enacted a temporary exemption for overtime income, but later chose to let that exemption expire when it became apparent that the revenue loss was a lot larger than they had originally anticipated. And then second, and this is going a little bit to a next layer of something that was queued up this morning, would be a recommendation to strongly consider raising new revenues, ideally through targeted solutions geared towards those most able to pay, who just received those significant federal tax cuts as we saw. So thinking here about the need to both fill emerging gaps stemming from those federal budget cuts and continuing to invest in its own needs. Vermont has a lot of options at its disposal to protect revenues and then also reinforce and enhance the revenue system moving forward. Our view is that wherever possible, it is really ideal for these efforts to focus on, those taxpayers most able to pay who have been reaping, significant benefit from the tax cuts enacted, both recently and extended through the recent plan, as well as the prior tax cuts enacted in 2017. There are a growing number of states, Colorado, Rhode Island, Washington, that have already begun moving in this direction, heading into their 2026 sessions by proposing fairly bold progressive revenue raising policies. There's no one right policy to pursue. We can get into that in conversation for sure. I know some kind of ripe options that have been discussed and considered at various times are looking at higher marginal rates on higher levels of income, commonly referred to across states, not just here as sort of millionaires taxes, looking further at how to tighten the state's corporate income tax to more effectively block offshore tax avoidance, again, which I know we talked about a little bit this morning, and also just looking at ways to more robustly tax income earned passively through the holding of accumulated wealth, to echo that point around looking at things like potentially bolstering the state's capital gains tax or other measures, kind of thinking about how to more effectively tax wealth. These are measures that could enable Vermont to raise potentially hundreds of millions of dollars of additional revenue each year to support vital investments needed both in the wake of HR 1 and also to address the state's ongoing needs. And then just my third recommendation, and I'll wrap and we can kind of get into discussion and questions, is something we have not touched on this morning, is in our view, thinking about sensibly drawing on the state's strategic savings in this legislative session and potentially over the next couple of years. So to be clear, states cannot and should not look to kind of their rainy day funds to adequately solve for new ongoing costs from HR 1 or just in general. We do think that leveraging strategic savings to cover some of the bill's sort of essentially various startup costs for things like Medicaid work requirements and to soften that initial blow from federal cuts is a sensible approach. So again, if I'm reading correctly, Vermont's rainy day fund in 2025 fiscal year stood at about 19% of general fund spending. That puts it well above the national median, which is 13%. And we sort of view the generally accepted best practice with rainy day funds to be about 10 to 15% of kind of regular state spending and reserves. So that means there's a little cushion there to consider sort of sensibly, not getting carried away, of course, tapping strategic savings for certain aspects of these fiscal challenges.
A question for you about that. So we have sometimes the oldest, sometimes the second oldest state in the country. We have a, pretty significant pension obligations. And between those two things, our credit rating is something that we need to work very hard to maintain. And the rainy day funds are really very careful management of them is really the thing that saves us in the context of those other much less controllable factors. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think that's a very fair point that I certainly don't want to be seen as contradicting at all, which is that having a very sort of fiscally conservative, really thoughtful, measured approach to keeping enough in the rainy day fund is just a critically important tentpole of state and local finance generally. And so I wouldn't want to be advocating for sort of all of a sudden, far too aggressively digging too deep to sort of supplant the need for broader solutions around revenue and around tax policy. We're really viewing this, in Vermont and in states generally, although it does vary a lot from state to state, to your point around past policies when it comes to savings, in states where the norm and the practice has been to have that healthiest approach to savings, to have sort of enough, for lack of a better word, set aside. There is some room to use that as one tool in the toolbox for, again, ideally some of the more like one-time costs that are coming online in the next year or two from the bill. And then to have those other revenue policy solutions in the mix as well.
And so if you were to offer, I remember when I first started in the legislature, I asked the question, like, how rainy is a rainy day, right? Like, when do we know it's raining? Because it often feels like it's raining. Well, snowing, I guess, might be we should probably call it the snowy day fund. Do you, what sort of framework or guidance would you offer to stay conservative enough for a bond rating and still, I heard you say one-time costs that we have sort of no choice on. Is that how else would you build that out?
Sure. There are a couple of things coming to mind. One is I should be clear that I would not want to offer any form of advice that would then be sort of, well, as long as you don't go below 12%,
Yes.
you won't ever get dinged.
You're not Moody's.
Yeah,
We will not take you as Moody's.
I'm not Moody's, but generally, we view the literature on this and the practice across states as that sort of, 10 to ideally 15% range of, having that strategic savings on hand really is viewed as a best practice. There are a lot of states below that have not gotten sort of fully dinged by the credit agencies because of the suite of factors that they take into account. But particularly for a state that has some of those other things, such as long-term pension obligations you're referencing, there's a bit of still erring on the side of caution, I would say, that I do endorse. I'm just saying because of the layering of cost coming in from HR 1, some of which are a bit, let's call them relatively significant, but relatively smaller. There are those one-time startup costs on the administrative side. Those are things where it makes absolute sense, to pull those one-time funds within reason for what they're designed for, which is a rainy day and protecting the state's people and communities kind of in response to unforeseen circumstances. I think once states that get into territory of continuously tapping strategic savings sort of year after year or every couple of years to sort of try to mask a little bit more structural deficiencies in their revenue system, in their tax systems, are where states really get into trouble. I think states that say, hey, we have a one-time need, there's a crisis or something that's adjacent to a crisis, pulling out funds to address that, and then sort of going back to healthy savings practices, that's obviously going to be seen in a much more positive light than those states with an ongoing sort of suspect practices, if you will, around how often they pull on their reserves.
Thank you. Yeah, Representative Meslin.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for bringing up the question of rainy day funds. As Chair Kornheiser alluded to, we've got some significant things that we need to cover here. Pensions and various other sorts of stuff. And one approach, if we were to have a discussion about that, might be to start with things that we really best not eliminate or leave uncovered no matter what, and work our way down and see what is left. It might be, and I bet it'll turn out to be not very much, but it's not my call because I'm not the treasurer, but there are some things that we best not touch no matter what, and sort of work our way through the list and see where we end up. But I suppose it's a good time as any to have a discussion throughout this session. So thank you.
And I didn't mean to bring us too far deep into detail there. So I wonder if you could sort of reframe what you said before I asked my question. Because it's sort of a list. I picked one thing off the list now.
Oh, that's good. And this is actually a great place to close and just move to discussion, because I am sort of at the end of my, if you will, like prepared kind of testimony here. But just to maybe conclude with a little bit of that recap is our sort of, modest take and set of recommendations from a framework moving forward. Again, echoing this morning is to be really focused and smart and thoughtful on conformity, protecting revenues. And I would emphasize sort of protecting revenues in the short term as a first order of business. Our second recommendation is to think a bit more kind of expansively about the needs of the moment and then how critical revenue is to a response to HR1, to sort of the people and communities that state and local budgets serve, by thinking genuinely about options to raise revenue, sort of just in a tax policy sense, ideally in a progressive way from our vantage. And then third is sort of, again, at least thinking about sensibly drawing on rainy day funds in a state that sort of has that traditional healthy savings practice. And so, again, that's where I'll conclude. Just with a note that, again, I give a lot of presentations like this on the range of challenges stemming from HR1 and recent federal actions fiscally, and again, to what could be genuine, harm to real people when it comes to things like Medicaid and SNAP cuts. But, those presentations can sometimes get a little heavy, a little dour almost at times. But it's, I don't think it is discounting those things and discounting the challenges to think about there really being a moment of opportunity for states, Vermont and elsewhere, to really kind of, not to get too messagey, but shine a potential light on a brighter path of, what could be a response that really invests in people and goes in a forward direction here in the coming years. So I'll conclude there and open it up.
Thank you.
Okay, this is to expand on Representative Maslin's question about what we should look at as far as, what our priorities are. But another thing that hasn't really been mentioned, we talked about all different ways to create new revenue. And, with that discussion that I think we should talk about is what is there that we don't necessarily need? I mean, Vermont ranks among the highest of public employees compared to the population. I'm not, it's just something to consider as far as overburdening again the very few, Vermont residents that are here that are paying taxes. So it's certainly an issue, but I haven't heard much talk about reduction in in the ways to do that, which isn't really up to you. That's our bailiwick, but.
You have any thoughts on that? I mean, I think what, public employment does to the economy of a region is a really interesting thing. I don't know if that's something you would be interested in speaking to.
Sure. I mean, I don't have deep expertise on sort of public employment in particular and sort of, if you will, the ratios of how they vary across states, worker per population, that sort of thing. I'm thinking back a little bit to something that Carl highlighted this morning around some of the public opinion research when it comes to taxes and spending is, people think about taxes in sort of a few different ways and from a few different angles. There are those who sort of view them a little bit more with that like pure civic duty, proud to pay taxes type framework. That's fine for people who feel that way. For a lot of folks, it is more of a value proposition. Folks who are relatively content, if you will, to pay taxes as long as there's a sense that they're getting, sort of a good set of things in return around quality education, infrastructure, paved and then plowed roads here in a place like Vermont. And so thinking about, are there ways to take a really thoughtful look at the spending side of the ledger? I won't prescribe what those are in Vermont and probably any state other than the one where I live, around where there might be opportunities for efficiencies, for savings. But I'm not one, as someone who advocates, or oftentimes has a perspective that additional revenues are something that states have a little more room to lean into and to use for investments. I certainly am not going to say that there are never opportunities for savings and efficiencies, or at least being able to take a really hard look at those things to help reinforce, the sense of value and buy-in that citizens, including corporate citizens of a state, feel that they're getting out of their state and local governments.
Thanks for that.
My question is more on a larger sense, looking down the road. Seems like the trend right now is for the federal government to pull back from state support, and we have about 36% of our funds coming from the federal government. And then we've got questions about whether or not disaster declarations are being honored by the federal government. So it seems like we're vulnerable to being cut off at some point. So the question is, do you see that as an ongoing trend that we have to prepare for, not just this year, but next year, the year after, so that we should be more self-sufficient?
No one has a crystal ball, but my short answer would be yes. In that the trend that we've been seeing in state and local finance, I think in some ways going back to kind of before, especially maybe not before my life on this world, but at least my 15 years in this work, is sort of flat, kind of funding, inflation level funding at best, coming from the federal government to states and localities, with a little bit of a blip, if you will, with the American Rescue Plan and the sort of major, arguably, many would argue, necessary federal response to that crisis, that provided a lot of support for state and local budgets, and especially 21 and 22. The trend has been sort of flat federal support at best for a long time. I've sat in a fair amount of rooms recently, particularly, with some groups that work with a lot of state and local officials who do at least have a question around whether we're moving into a kind of new normal or a new era when it comes to federalism generally, of more responsibilities being either more heavily shared or in some cases more heavily delegated to the state and local level than we've seen in sort of the prior era, if you will. You named some of what those could be around disaster response. There's also sort of a more general pullback from federal climate funding in HR 1. And there are additional congressional debates and in some cases administrative proposals to look at potentially fairly serious funding reductions for things beyond healthcare and food assistance and climate, which were the three focuses of HR 1 that could affect things like funding streams for K through 12 education. Childcare is something that is really been in the news just the last few weeks around something the federal government is really heavily debating. Those pots of money, transit, housing, I could go on. There are potentially significant additional pressures is something that I really would lift up kind of more thematically in this conversation. That looking further out, 5, 10, 15 years, I think should at least be kind of in the back of folks' minds in rooms like this on the state and local level. We don't know what we don't know. But there are sort of, again, additional pressures potentially kind of hiding, if you will, down the road when it comes to future Congresses and administrations.
Other questions? Yeah, what was that?
When you talk about raising progressive revenues, raising taxes on high income earners, et cetera. What is the relationship in states that have more progressive tax structures and economic activity? Because there's like questions about whether, well, if we tax high income earners and then they leave, we're without that revenue. And conversely, if folks are in the lower 50% of high income earners and they're worried about just making a rent, they're spending significantly less money in the local economy. Sales tax revenue that gets generated. So I'm just wondering what the interconnectedness is between progressive tax revenues and economic activities in different states. And, when we're if we're tinkering with one aspect of the tax code in the economy, that has impacts in other areas. So I'm just curious your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, Representative. And there are a few thoughts coming to mind that I'll sort of try to unpack, I think. One is a little bit of a conceit I like to offer on this topic at times is, I think if we were considering, again, for lack of a better word, progressive revenue raising policies, really it's sort of another measure that we're a bit sort of over the frontier of what has traditionally been considered like the realms of state and local finance. If a state was out of nowhere considering, let's say, a 20% top rate or some sort of really sort of confiscatory, I struggle with that word, version of a business tax or a sort of never before really analyzed or researched form of a wealth tax that we didn't know how it was going to work. I think it would be very, very reasonable for folks to look at that and say, well, this is something that's going to have economic implications and potentially harm that are difficult to foresee, and that we should maybe sort of, back off the gas and sort of bring this back more into the realm of the standard guardrails of the debate. And so I say that to say, or I say that to get to a point that I think once we're in sort of what would be considered the normal sort of range of mainstream proposals, even more on the higher tax side of things, states that have millionaires taxes, sort of a bit more robust, if you will, business or corporate taxation. The states that have taxed higher gains at a little bit marginally higher of a rate. And then conversely, on the other side of that, states that have taken more of the low tax, even a no income tax approach. Within that range, I think that state policies I think the impact of state policies that sort of tinker with their tax systems on their state economies is actually generally a little bit overblown in both directions. And so particularly in the short term, which is sort of, something I want to get to with another layer here, but focusing on sort of short-term economic growth. What we've seen is states that have sort of embraced this idea of cutting in particular personal and corporate income tax rates to try to boost their economies. There actually are fairly middling results, right? There were a lot of states in the late 2000s into the early 2010s that sort of took this road. Ohio, Kansas, North Carolina, a couple of others. We've done a study, and others, including Carl's team, have done studies looking at those states on things like job growth, personal income growth, sort of unemployment rates. And they really didn't shift substantially. And the performance of those states relative to more moderate or higher tax neighbors didn't really substantially differ all that much. Conversely, I did some analysis a few years ago looking at, I believe it was 9 states that enacted basically some version of a millionaire's tax in the 2010s and how those states compared economically to their neighbors. And it was kind of a mixed bag of, those states didn't all of a sudden do better than all their neighbors. They didn't all of a sudden do worse than their neighbors. But, without having that study in front of me, it was, I think 5 of the 9 states had slightly better job growth than their neighbors. I think 6 of the 9 had sort of unemployment rates that were lower than their neighbors, that kind of thing. And what I think those sorts of analyses together point to is an idea that, the focus of tax policy, the focus of revenue policy, is really sort of, I think, more so thought in the short term, less around its linkage to, are you going to sort of jumpstart or stall your economy a little bit versus kind of what are the needs of our states? What are the challenges for people and communities that we can solve with some additional dollars? Again, in a way that is not way out here on some fringe of a 20% top tax rate or something like that, but within reason, generating the dollars needed for the sorts of investments that can help the state thrive. That brings me to the last point on this question, which I think there are some interesting questions around long-term growth prospects and long-term strategies around economies that states can adopt that are something that, in candor, there's not necessarily a hard and fast research finding of if you raise progressive revenues from those most able to pay and invest them in things like good schools, good roads, people having access to healthcare, whatever your chosen issue is. I can't point to a hard and fast study that says you're going to have a stronger, longer term economy by investing in that human capital and that physical capital. But my general read of states' experience and of the sort of research as a whole, if you will, is that there's a strong case to be made, that that's a very, very strong foundation for long-term, more equitable prosperity, if you will.
And I think we've heard over the past year and even the past week that when it comes to like our roads, our schools and our healthcare systems, we're having some foundational problems right now. And using, you also said earlier, there's no one size fits all, there's no one right option, but doing whatever we can to build stronger foundations for even just those three sectors be very important.
Representative Woody?
Thank you.
Mhm.
So I heard you talk about the economic impact of like the millionaire tax.
Right.
But did you look at how much the state, each of those states relies on how many people to pay, how much of the general fund? Are we in a more risky situation because we don't have so many people pay, and they pay so much of what the general fund takes in? Just, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how, sort of how to think about that. I would say the short answer is no to your immediate question is that looking at sort of the number of people contributing a certain share of the general fund is not something I have a sort of a number handy on or that we've done an analysis on. There are a couple of things coming to mind though. One is this is going to reiterate something that was said this morning, that Carl said this morning, is sort of one of the reasons why that dynamic exists, federally in a lot of states of, is that the income is concentrated enough at the top because of, rising and persistent inequality over decades, that it just sort of flows mathematically a bit in a way that arguably in an ideal world, there would be less income concentrated at the top and there would be a broader swath of sort of wealthy adjacent people, let's calling it, contributing, a larger share to the general fund. The second thing I would note though is, it is perfectly reasonable and it comes up very commonly in any state, sort of concerns around if there's a bit too high of taxation on personal incomes at the top, that it might sort of create that form of instability a little bit, in part by potentially causing, some share of those people, to relocate for tax reasons. My general read on that is sort of like threefold really quick, and I won't sort of like write a novel here or anything. But one is that generally the sort of risk of that tax-induced flight across state lines is not zero. I'll be the first to admit it's not zero, but it tends to be a bit overblown or a bit overemphasized, I think, in these sorts of debates. Because there may be a couple people in states that take targeted measures at the top who choose to relocate, but most don't because of the durability of their community ties, family ties, employment ties, so on and so forth. That sort of gets to the second point that we often like to highlight, which is, I think, as a sort of bottom line, no state has ever enacted sort of a high income targeted income tax increase and not raised money and not raised in most cases a very significant amount of money Massachusetts is a great example of this. Their sort of fair share of 4% surcharge, I'm sure folks are familiar with, has actually increasingly been coming in higher than original estimates and original projections of that. They've been exceeding expectations. And I think in part, without having dived into fully the academic studies on this, that some of the fears that were being baked into the estimates around that potential millionaire flight are not coming to pass as much as they might thought that they would have. Third, and just real quick on this, I think there is a really interesting point sort of as part of your question around sort of state and local tax systems and revenue raising, wanting to keep, wanting to keep stability in mind as an important goal. States that massively over rely on one type of tax versus another. Oregon comes to mind in this front as a state that is really heavily reliant on personal income taxes. Do see the sorts of fluctuations with the economic cycle that can cause complications for the sorts of things that I care deeply about and advocate about, sort of reliable support for public services. So I think without having sort of, Carl's tables in front of me and what have you, my sense is that Vermont does an admirable job of maintaining sort of a mix of different types of taxes and revenues that allow it to not become overly reliant on any single tax in a way that in my, again, humble and take provides a little bit of room to explore, more targeted options on certain revenue raisers, including personal income taxes.
That helps.
Yeah, Representative Mokel. That was so helpful in terms of thinking about, and I really appreciate your examples from other states too. And I think we have work to do on the other side. One of the challenges that I see in Vermont is that one of the downsides of being very dependent on the federal government, and we are a state that depends on federal transfers, is that we've also made a lot of our own state policy reflect the compensatory models at the federal level. And I can remember sitting in a district and just doing the math and looking at how much it cost us to comply and how much we were receiving and deciding it was not worth taking the federal money. And I say that, and I can think of several funding streams, and I think we're seeing that today. And there's also an opportunity here. And I wondered if you're seeing that at all nationally, where if we aren't going to be heavily subsidized by the federal government, does it make sense to use the kinds of compensatory models and the extensive bureaucratic cost and time and accountability that sometimes comes with that? Because I'm wondering if there's an opportunity here to rethink some of our ways of doing business and delivering.
Sure. I'll probably confess, this is probably getting a little to the edges of my own personal expertise, but largely thinking about sort of, are there ways to strategically be less reliant on federal funding streams versus becoming more self-sufficient?
And
Yeah.
also bring down costs in the process, because why pay for extensive bureaucratic whatever if you actually don't need it?
Yeah, I think, just thinking about it intuitively, what some of those opportunities, might be to explore that, I would probably want to think about or maybe point to a follow-up resource or a fellow expert on. But I do think there is something to the idea of, the potential value states, would have from more the flexibility that comes from being able to use their own dollars raised through, sustainable, best practice, sensible ways. I do think thinking relatively a little bit, kind of about maybe something constructive to say here is about the range to which states are reliant on federal funding versus their own dollars, I think actually does speak some degree of volume. So when you look at the states, and I'm not going to pull up a table on this, that are most reliant on federal funding, it tends to be states that we don't necessarily associate with the best outcomes for people and communities and public policy. And so like the top of the list is Louisiana, where I think it's about 50% of their budget. This is nothing against my Cajun friends. I love my friends. But they're about 50% of their budget is funded by the federal government. Another way of looking at that is they're not raising what could be described, I think, reasonably fairly as enough dollars to give them the range of tools and the flexibility needed to explore various sorts of policy solutions. There are other states very high up on that list. as well, that would be a similar model. But I would just echo that as another reason to really strongly consider, the importance of an at best adequate and, something to be said for more than adequate and kind of, stronger and more robust revenue system to give that tool in the toolbox for funding various needs.
Right, I wasn't trying to discount that. I'm just saying when you do have the revenue tool, then that actually opens a bunch of other doors as well.
Where is Vermont on that list?
Pardon me?
Where is Vermont on that list at 36%?
Ooh, yeah, I'd have to pull up the list. I could, I could do that relatively easily. But at 36%, I think that's going to be actually fairly low. If folks don't mind me taking a look.
We didn't want to do nominal.
Yeah. Actually, I would hate to derail with a Google search here. I can get that information back to you, but at 36%, it's certainly not the top of the list. I think that's in the lower half of the distribution.
Any other questions?
What's the lowest amount coming in, do you know? I mean, what is different about, do they have just oil revenue that they can take and not rely on the federal government for money? Is that,
Some of it is going to actually,
We're number, I don't know if the source is any good. We're number.
Let's get all that anyway. Let's,
What are we?
Doesn't matter.
we're not kidding.
Get the website, we're not.
What was your question?
so for states that are less reliant on the federal government, are there other more consistent revenue sources for them that are not reflected in income taxes or other things such as oil revenue?
yeah, no, it's a good question. And
Is it more about eligibility for federal funds than
Yes,
capacity to not use federal funds?
so there's a mix of factors. One is to that point, some of the diversity and how much sort of funds states are pulling down from the federal government is through nothing remotely nefarious, but is largely sort of demographic and socioeconomic factors around sort of more folks, being eligible for Medicaid, more people being eligible for various sorts of federal benefits. That then means they're pulling down a greater number of funds. So relatively poor states are going to, naturally through no fault of their own, I might say, be a little bit more reliant on federal funds. And then there are also a mix of other factors that I think probably do to some degree include sort of access to certain types of additional resources like, natural wealth, oil and otherwise. And then the third would be, the policy choices. So states that are going to, I think, be relatively less dependent on federal funds, I think there would be some linkages, some, correlation, if you will, with states that put a bit more higher of a priority on sort of raising revenues of their own. In some cases, not deliberately to become less reliant on the federal government, but just because they have additional state dollars, the federal share of the pie is going to be smaller, right?
There was the thing about it with states, and every state who is eligible is probably pulling down as much as they can from the federal government and curtailing their own budget. Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
We appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, and we're all gonna have a lot of reading to do after you
Yeah, I'll send these.
discuss all those things, yeah. Representative Meslin.
Yep, Madam Chair, behind me is Haley Steinbach, who's a UVM senior interning with me this session. First time I've had a intern the whole time I've been here.
Oh, wow.
Poli-sci senior at UVM, and I'm sure I'll learn as much from her as she'll learn from us.
I imagine that's true too.
So what she may, you may see her walk in and sit down from time to time. And, wish you well, you know.
Thank you, I'm excited to be here.
Welcome.
This is a committee to be in. We're all about it.
So just so folks know, sort of the next step, Teddy has three bills that are all in a delightful stack tomorrow morning that address some of what we talked about today. And then the next thing on the agenda for next week is really looking at this. Did you call it revenue retention?
There's no-
Protection?
Yeah.
Preservation, thank you. I knew there was like a cute phrase and I didn't know what
It's
it
a bit of
was.
pick your word. There's no official word.
I like it. No, so focus on revenue preservation. So looking at federal conformity. And if we have time next week, also thinking about auditing, et cetera, that types of things. Sort of the tax department's capacity on all that. So that's sort of the next step in our work on federal tax law. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.